Welcome to the Subjective Professor podcast, where we reject coercion and hypocrisy. It's Wednesday, April 16th, 2025, episode 363. Are we all fascists now? So, someone I know posts all these pictures of signs that she sees around her town and supposedly all fighting against fascism. Uh, and it's pointing at Trump. It's making references to Donald Trump as being the biggest fascist ever, as if Harris wasn't or Biden wasn't. And it's a little frustrating. So, because they're basically imputing fascism with anything they don't like. It's sort of like when I would ask my students if it's okay to punch a Nazi, and they all said, yeah, but they were thinking about people who they thought were Nazis without actually understanding what a Nazi was. So I went back to Benito Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism. It's a short little work, shorter than even the Communist Manifesto, and it kind of it's interesting. But if you ever wanted to look into the mind of someone who's not quite right or not necessarily has all of their marbles where they should be in their head, then you should give it a read. And that's how they sound, right? So on the one hand, it sounds cogent and coherent, but on the other hand, it's just basically babble. Okay. So I'll just highlight some of the more interesting aspects of the doctrine of fascism by Benito Mussolini. And why Mussolini? Because he's the guy who basically popularized the use of that word. And I remember I was playing Call of Duty 2 way back when, uh, before the whole modern warfare versions came out. And there was one scene where the Soviets are attacking German positions, and the Russians are all screaming, kill the fascists. And which was really confusing because, fascism, the way that I understood it, was just basically an expression of socialism or communism, which is what Nazis and communists both were. And so it was a little confusing. I thought, wow, okay, they hate them because they're fascists, but they all are fascists, right? And so that's when I had my first sort of taste of how people confuse and misuse a lot of words, or at least another example of when that happens. So anyway, Mussolini first admits that there are different expressions of fascism. Of course, there are different expressions of fascism. There's nothing monolithic. Okay, I'll take that back. I can't think of anything that is monolithic when it comes to a concept. You will always have slight, subtle differences depending on the person who has those beliefs or maybe studying that or using the term, right? And they'll adapt it in various ways. And so what I like to do is define a concept in the most broadest sense, a very Socratic way of looking at a concept, like what is the essential character of or characteristic substance of a concept. And from that, you can see all of the different varieties and expression, but they're all different varieties of the same thing. So there's an ant, A-N-T, but then there are fire ants, there are black ants, there's flying ant, right? So you have all these different varieties, but they all share the same characteristic of being an ant. And so fascism, there are different forms of fascism, but they're all expressions of fascism, and socialism is uh, you know very much part of fascism. As much as Mussolini wants to distance himself from socialism, the fact that he has to just says how closely related they actually are. So Now, this is from Mussolini. Fascism is opposed to all individualistic abstractions. So fascism opposes the individual. And right there, right, and he goes on, uh, it is anti-individualistic. The fascist conception of life stresses the importance of the state and accepts the individual only insofar as his interests, the individual's interests, coincide with those of the state, which stand for the conscience and the universal will of man as a historic entity. It is opposed to classical liberalism, which arose as a reaction to absolutism and exhausted its historical function when the state became the expression of the conscience and will of the people. Personally, I would classify myself as classical liberal, right? Someone who is all about the individual and freedom. And he's saying that directly opposite to that is fascism, right? And I emphasize that because a lot of people today will call people like me a fascist when it's they who are the fascists, right? So liberalism denied the state in the name of the individual. Fascism reasserts the rights of the state as expressing the real essence of the individual. Wow, that's something, right? So it's the state that's going to tell you what the essence of the individual is. That's just wonderful. And if liberty is to be the attribute of living men and not of abstract dummies invented by individualistic liberalism, then fascism stands for liberty and for the only liberty worth having, the liberty of the state and of the individual within the state. And so this is, you begin to see what I mean by this sort of, it seems logical, but it's crazy logic, right? The fascist conception of the state is all embracing. Outside of it, no human or spiritual values can exist, much less have value. Thus, understood, fascism is totalitarian, and the fascist state, a synthesis and a unit inclusive of all values, interprets, develops, and potentates the whole life of a people, right? And so there's nothing but the state. And so we might live in a country that's governed by the state, but our individual values and wants and lives only matter if they are in line with the state. And so there is no individual, there's just the state. He goes on. He wants to say that he rejects socialism, but as I said before, fascism is a kind of socialism in that the cost of all of the policies and decisions are put on society. So basically, the way he describes the state is that it's basically God. And so I quote, the fascist state, as a higher and more powerful expression of personality, is a force, but a spiritual one. It sums up all the manifestations of the moral and intellectual life of man. Fascism does not, generally speaking, believe in the possibility or utility of perpetual peace. Therefore, all doctrines which postulate peace at all costs are incompatible with fascism, right? And it makes sense, right? The more centralized the will of a country or a government, the more that you're going to have war, right? Because it comes into conflict with other people. And hey, who are you to tell me I can't encroach on your borders or take your stuff, right? And so it always comes to violence, right? And so the individual, though, will seek to figure out how to resolve issues, overcome them, to maintain peace. And this is what the fascist absolutely opposes. So fascism as an organized, centralized, authoritarian democracy. Fascism is definitely and absolutely opposed to the doctrines of liberalism, both in the political and the economic sphere. If liberalism spells individualism, fascism spells government, right? Those are lines I picked out from the Doctrine of Fascism. And his arguments basically are, self-justifying, really, much like what I already quoted. So I don't know what the expression is, double speak, talking out of both sides of his mouth. So he's saying all these grandiose things, but it's impossible, right? And so we know the result of Mussolini's rule is that basically it was war. It ultimately resulted in a lot of destruction for that country. Nevertheless, I believe that fascism lives on because government still exists. So basically, analysis time, basically, to be pro-government in any way is to be pro-fascist, right? So if government is fascism and liberalism is individualism, well, the more we emphasize the individual, the more we are anti-fascist, right? We're anti-government. So I learned a long time ago that fascism was government control of private businesses. I think Ron Paul might have said that. It is one aspect of it, right? Because if there is no individual, there is no private business. There's only government control of everything that goes on in society. So that's fascism. So erasing the individual and pretending that the state, aka Mussolini, is the absolute expression of the individual is kind of a crock, right? It's just not possible, right? So Mussolini is saying, no, no, no. The state expresses what the individual, should want, is wants, and so therefore tells them what he wants. And he goes on to talk about how the government has to control education. And so he is interested in erasing individual wants and desires while preserving his own to be expressed through the monopoly power of the state. And so if you think about yesterday's episode, when I talk about taxes and how it is impossible for the government to intervene into the marketplace and have a better outcome than billions of people, uh, you know, acting out their uh, desires in the market collectively. So government can only interfere and deny the desires of the individual because the government is nothing but a bunch of individuals, or in this case, Mussolini is one man. And so basically he's saying, I know everything and I'm always right and I'm perfect. So therefore everyone has to do how I think things should be done. Right. And that's basically fascism. Robert Higgs, who often speaks at Mises Institute events, he wrote a book called Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government, way back in 1987. That's when I graduated college. He was already writing great stuff like this. And he mentions there this idea of participatory fascism. Basically, since we all live in the United States, no matter how much we despise fascism, we are all hopelessly tied to this fascistic system. And so we're participatory fascists, right? And so hence the title, We're All Fascists Now. And so to call each other a fascist is, well, it's kind of irrelevant, right? But that is in fact what people love to do, right? And so it's reminiscent of how I break down race. We're all racists. And so to call someone a racist, it means nothing. And so to call each other a fascist today means nothing. The whole system that we live in is fascistic. And so to live in this society means we're participating in fascism. And I know some people will say, no, I'm off the grid, I'm independent. Yeah, well, but still, if we use anything that's manufactured, right? Unless you're making your own clothes, and if you have glasses and you made your own glasses, then we somehow participate in this fascistic society. And so the only true anti-fascist position right? Not saying that you're not a fascist, but an anti-fascistic position is to be a radical anarchist like Michael Malice, right? So we are individuals and we must be free to pursue our goals and our desires. You know, if everyone did this, then the bad ideas will be revealed and they'll be left behind in favor of better ideas. And even if someone prefers what might be perceived as a bad idea over a good idea, that's okay because so few people will subscribe to the bad idea that it would be pretty much irrelevant, right? It's sort of like the KKK is bad. Well, I mean, everyone in America knows this. And so that's why the joke is that the KKK is basically all FBI informants, right? Right? Because no one wants to be associated with such a bad idea, known bad idea, except unless you are paid to do so by the federal government. In other words, no one wants to be the loser with the bad ideas. And so people gravitate naturally to better ideas. Even sociopaths and psychopaths will strive to adhere to more profitable ideas. Sociopaths and psychopaths, I've talked about this before, are incentivized by society to pursue, terrible ideas like, serial murder, torture, whatever, right? They're incentivized to do that. And so that's why they do it. But if our society is structured in a way that better ideas are always what is favored, then the sociopaths and the psychopaths will generally, strive to do that better than anybody else. And so, because they are producing so much value for society, no one really cares or even worries about the sociopath and the psychopath, unless, just like any other criminal, right, they do something that violates someone's property rights and then you go after them. So people today, they say they hate fascists, but they are the fascists because they desire government to do their bidding, right? So all of us are participatory fascists, but some of us are truly fascists, right? Uh, so they're so fascist that they will openly support fascist organizations because they hate other organizations even more, right? So people who support Ukraine in their war against Russia, I'll point out that a lot of the units and people in Ukraine are openly Nazis, fascists, right? And they'll say, yeah, but Putin is worse, right? And it's just this really weird situation where people are going to say that certain people are worse than Nazis or AKA fascists, which is funny to me. But as soon as they said that, I don't talk to them anymore because clearly they're not serious people, right? And he's a professor somewhere, and it just kind of, I feel sorry for all of his students. But this is, how people drift into hypocrisy through this narrow-minded, arrogant thinking, just like what Mussolini did, right? So he was so stuck on himself, right? He was so full of himself that he couldn't believe that he was wrong. And so everything that he said was truth, right? And that's the problem, right? That's where you run into hypocrisy and that's where you become extremely twisted, right? So to fight fascism, uh, you do so by being unapologetically individualist, right? You are pro-individual. That means you stand for freedom, absolutely, right? It's the only truly anti-fascist position. And so just being in favor of freedom makes you uh, not a fascist. But as soon as you say, oh, no, but freedom is dangerous, right? Yeah, then you're a fascist. Well, that's it for this episode. Uh, be happy, stay free. I'll talk to you next time.